Chapter 10 covers servant leadership. Now, servant leadership isn't a complete leadership theory. It doesn't describe nearly as many other things as the other leadership theories. And in fact, this is just one small aspect, or perhaps a large aspect, of leadership that can make a real difference. But it's not in contrast to other types of leadership. It's something that could be used in addition to all the other theories that we've looked at so far. Now, this whole concept of servant leadership is a paradox. It's the idea that the leader is going to serve other people, but at the same time, the leader is going to influence other people. And a lot of times we don't put those two ideas together. And a lot of the scholarship and the research that's been done on servant leadership are just people's ideas on what does it mean to be a really good leader that cares for the people that they lead. But during this century, there has been a good amount of research that's been done on what happens when leaders put followers first, and what are those effects. So let's talk about servant leadership. Now, servant leadership, at least the modern 20th century version of it, was started with Greenleaf, and he wrote a real popular book called Servant Leadership. And he said that servant leadership begins with the natural feeling that one wants to serve first. So servant leadership starts with this idea that you want to serve and do good to other people. That's the beginning part of it, wanting to take your energies and efforts and do good things to other people. Then he says, after you have this desire to serve first, then conscious choice brings one to aspire to leadership. So if you see that the best way that you can help out a group of people is by leading them, you'll do it because that's a way of serving them. Now, if you want to dominate people or get ahead or have greater influence, that people will simply do what you want, then servant leadership's not going to happen. Servant leadership starts where our main concern is serving and caring about other people. And if the best way to serve and care about other people is to lead them, then you'll use servant leadership. And he says the best test to see if leadership is servant leadership is, do those served grow as persons? Do they, while being served, become healthier, wiser, freer, more autonomous, more likely themselves to become servants? So this is the idea is that if you're really serving people, they're going to become better people. They're going to be healthier, wiser, freer, more autonomous, and more likely to serve others if you serve them. Then another question they ask is, and what is the effect on the least privileged in the society? Will they benefit, or at least will they not be further deprived? Will our servant leadership affect the rest of society, people that are hurting? Will we make society better so that those who are suffering the most can help? So, servant leadership sets the bar pretty high on what can be expected of a leader. Now, sometimes servant leadership is treated as a trait, because if you have somebody who's narcissistic or domineering or very self-centered, there's not much of a chance that they're going to take on an attitude of servant leadership. But here, in this textbook, we're going to treat it as a behavior or a set of behaviors in this chapter. Now, Greenleaf didn't try to do any research on his idea of servant leadership. He just wrote from his experiences. But there's been studies of Greenleaf's work, and Spear's version of Greenleaf's servant leadership says that there's 10 characteristics of a servant leader that Greenleaf proposed. 10 things that are essential for qualities and traits and abilities and behaviors that are necessary to be a servant leader. So we've got, first of all, listening. The servant leader has to listen to the people that he's trying to serve, because you can't just do what you want to really serve people. You have to know what their needs are. Empathy, the servant leader needs to have empathy for the people that they're leading, really care about them. Servant leaders need to be healing, looking at where people are suffering and doing what they can to relieve that suffering. There needs to be an awareness of everything around us, because there are so many needs and so many things that can influence us one way or another, that we need to be aware of what any decisions we make and whatever behaviors we have, what will be their impact. Leaders need to be gifted at gentle persuasion to help people do what's best for them. A sixth point, which is really important, is conceptualization. You need to be able to have the big picture of what's going on in an organization, in people's lives, because if you're going to lead them, you have to be able to lead them in light of everything that's going on. And if you can't do that any better than they can, then they don't really need you as a leader. Similarly, the seventh idea is foresight. You've got to have enough brain power and experience and thinking to be able to figure out what's going to happen if a follower does something, or if you do something. What will be the consequences, and will it be beneficial for the followers? Stewardship is the idea that we have different resources available to us, and we need to use all of those resources in the best way to benefit other people. There has to be a commitment to the growth of people, because that's a measure of successful servant leadership. Are people growing? And 10th, there has to be this commitment to building community, bringing people closer together in healthier relationships, so that they can work better together and experience a better life. So this servant leadership it's really pretty dramatic. Now there's other versions of servant leadership also, because depending on how you look at things, you can very easily have different versions. So the book presents 6 others, and if you look at this table, you can see that there's a lot of things that are in common, but there are other important qualities that some researchers focus on and some don't. And so all this basically means is that there's a lot of ways to view servant leadership, but the idea is serving the people that you're responsible for so that they benefit from what you do to them and for them. Now, when it comes to researching servant leadership, here we've got a chart from Leiden and the Associates that describe how we can think of servant leadership. And this is kind of true for any model of leadership. You've got a bunch of leadership behaviors, things that the servant leader does, and we can study antecedent conditions, what makes servant leader behaviors more likely, and we can study outcomes. What are the likely results of servant leader behaviors? And if the data supports this, then we can say that servant leadership functions as a good theory. Now, if the data doesn't support this, then we need to change the theory. So in Leiden's approach, the antecedents, things that make servant leadership more likely, depend on virtually everything. First of all, we have context and culture. What people expect of leaders, how they how much leadership they need, what type of projects they're doing, what the culture says that a leader is supposed to do. All those are going to affect how someone puts into practice leadership. Leader attributes are huge. As I mentioned before, if someone is dominating and narcissistic and is trying to get as much from other people as they can, it's almost for sure they're not going to have a servant leadership perspective. But if they are committed to the well-being of others and to helping them, then servant leadership can be a natural outgrowth of their attributes in their life altogether. And then there's the question of follow receptivity. Some followers are going to try to get away with as much as they can and do as little work as possible, and they're going to try to take advantage of servant leadership, and that's going to limit the ability of a servant leader to really serve other people. Now, the servant leader behaviors, we've only got 7 listed here, but you could put all 10 from the model that we looked at earlier, or you could just take any of the behaviors from that other chart we were looking at. And the idea is that these behaviors are supposed to have some outcomes. And some of the outcomes, like Greenleaf said, follower performance and growth are the most important. They become better people, they become better workers, are they healthier as individuals and as families. There's organizational performance, and a lot of people will claim that more servant leadership will lead to higher performing organizations. And there's a societal impact. Society will be better if people in power are more concerned with serving others than getting things for themselves. So that's the model of servant leadership and how it's supposed to function. So, summarizing, how does servant leadership work? Well, first of all, it's concerned with putting followers first and the outcomes that are likely to emerge. So it's like, okay, if I care about my people and I serve them, our organization will do well. Now, servant leadership works best when leaders are altruistic. That means they're concerned not primarily about themselves, but about others, and have a strong motivation to help others. That because of their values, helping others is a key part of their being. And servant leadership should result in community and societal change because of how people are treating each other. So let's look at the strengths and some of the criticisms of servant leadership. One of the strengths is it makes altruism and concern for others and willingness to sacrifice for the well-being of others the central component of the leadership process, which, if that's central to your values, and for me, that is central to my values, I would rather serve and do good to other people than to get promotions, make lots of money, be famous, have lots of power. That's what I value. So servant leadership is something that speaks a lot to me. It focuses on the well-being of others and what we can do to do better things for others. It provides also kind of a counterintuitive approach to the use of influence. A lot of times people think, oh, influence, that's dirty, that's polluted, that's corrupting. Nope. In servant leadership, leaders listen to followers, the leaders share control, and they only try to influence and persuade people for things that will benefit them. And even in terms of research, we've got some fairly good measures of servant leadership. Like the Servant Leadership Questionnaire, which is in your textbook, works pretty well to measure servant leadership. Now, as in all of these leadership theories, there's criticism. Because servant leadership appears contradictory, it may be seen as whimsical or just like somebody's wishful thinking or moralizing, forcing moral values on somebody, or not really leadership. And something interesting is that this is not the first time I've made this series of videos. This is the 8th edition of the textbooks. So I have these chapters for the 6th and 7th edition for the textbook. And servant leadership are among the videos that are viewed the least. I think that's probably because a lot of professors don't include this chapter in the textbook. They just don't take it seriously. It's not really leadership, and if you want to drop out one of the 16 chapters, why not drop out servant leadership? But I'm glad your professor didn't if you're watching this for your class. And second criticism is that researchers are unable to reach a consensus on a common definition or the theoretical framework for servant leadership. We've still got a bunch of different measures that work, but still it's not very mature as a science. There's no one dominant way of measuring servant leadership. Third criticism is an incomplete theory because it doesn't include other principles of leadership, such as directing, concern for production, things like that, things that are really important, but servant leadership doesn't have anything to say about a lot of aspects of leadership. And not enough research has been done to confirm the outcomes predicted by the theory, notably that servant leader organizations that have more servant leaders have better outcomes than than organizations that don't have servant leaders. So more research is needed to find out how this actually plays out in leadership. Now, at Azusa Pacific, we're really committed to biblical values, so we try to link the concepts in the textbook to biblical principles. And since the origin of servant leadership comes from the teachings of Jesus himself, this is really natural. Jesus said, and this is the origin 2,000 years ago of servant leadership, he said, "You know that the rulers of the nations dominate others, and that their great men exercise authority over others. But it's not this way among you. Whoever wishes to be great among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you shall be your slave." And so Jesus said, being dominating, being in control, being great among people, that's not what really counts. The way to be really great in God's kingdom is to be the servant of others. And the way to really be famous is to be the slave of everybody, to do what's good for them, not seeking for ourselves, but seeking the good of others.